Have you ever looked up at the stars on a clear night and felt a profound sense of mystery, a tingling suspicion that there's so much more to our story than we've been told? For thousands of years, these starry mysteries have been woven into the fabric of our myths and legends, from the colossal stones of Stonehenge that seem to point to something beyond our world, to the impossibly precise pyramids of Giza, whose construction still baffles engineers today. The history we learned in school feels like a single, well-worn path, but just off to the side, in the shadows of forgotten texts and whispered tales, lies another story entirely. It's a story of otherworldly beings, of a planet in crisis, and of the very creation of humanity itself. This isn't the history of kings and empires you're used to. It's a story etched into the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, a narrative that suggests our beginnings were not a matter of chance, but of a calculated, desperate intervention. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're just getting ready to drift off, maybe you could drop a comment with your location and local time, so we can all feel a little more connected, a little more together in this great, swirling mystery. Tonight, we're going to dive headfirst into one of the most compelling and controversial of these alternate histories, a journey that begins not on Earth, but in the vast, cold emptiness of space. The year was 1976, and a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would send shockwaves through the worlds of archaeology, history, and alternative theories. Sitchin, an author and translator of ancient cuneiform texts, proposed a radical new interpretation of Sumerian mythology. He suggested that the Anunnaki, a group of powerful deities often mentioned in these texts, were not gods at all, but rather extraterrestrial beings from a distant, undiscovered planet he called Nibiru. This was the third sentence, the one that changed everything, the one that made you pause and wonder. He claimed that these gods came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago with a single, urgent mission: to mine gold. And not just any gold, but a specific type of gold they needed to repair the deteriorating atmosphere of their home planet. Now, Sitchin's work is a real lightning rod. Historians and mainstream scholars have largely dismissed his interpretations, pointing out that his translations of Sumerian are, to put it mildly, highly selective and often deviate from accepted academic consensus. But, and this is a big but, his work sparked a global fascination with the Anunnaki, bringing these ancient figures into the modern conversation in a way they never had been before. So let's step into Sitchin's world for a little while, a place where myths are treated as historical records and legends are just history told in a different language. In this version of our past, we are not the sole result of millions of years of random evolutionary selection. Instead, we are the product of a sophisticated genetic engineering project. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki, tired of the backbreaking labor in the mines, decided they needed a new workforce. So they took a pre-existing hominid, something like Homo erectus, and mixed its DNA with their own. The result? Homo sapiens. Us, the perfect slave race. It's a wild theory, isn't it? The idea that our entire existence, our very consciousness, was designed for a purpose we've forgotten, all to serve a master race from another world. The narrator's voice, a quiet whisper in the dark, finds a soft rhythm, gently pulling you into the narrative, each word a step deeper into the ancient world. This story is filled with the kind of cosmic drama you'd find in a blockbuster movie, but instead of Hollywood, the backdrop is the fertile crescent of ancient Mesopotamia. The stakes are immense: the survival of an entire civilization from another planet, the creation of a new species, and the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance. As we settle in, imagine for a moment what it would be like to look up at the sky and see a world that wasn't your own, a world that was your true home, slowly dying. That's where our story truly begins, not with us, but with them, the Anunnaki, and their desperate struggle for survival. They were a civilization on the brink, and their impending doom would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of human history. Their journey to a small blue planet would be a last-ditch effort, a gamble against extinction, and a decision that would create the very species now listening to their story. So our story truly begins not on Earth, but on a different world entirely, a world that was, according to these ancient tablets, dying. The Anunnaki called this planet Nibiru, and their home was a place of great beauty and immense technological advancement. But it was also a place suffering from a fatal flaw. Nibiru's atmosphere was slowly, irrevocably deteriorating. A gradual leak of the essential gases that sustained life had begun, a sort of cosmic, slow-motion catastrophe that no one could seem to stop. The Nibiruan sky, once a brilliant and vibrant canopy, was growing thin and pale, like an old photograph bleached by the sun. The air was becoming a precious commodity, and with each passing year, the threat of extinction grew more and more real. This wasn't a sudden asteroid impact or a rogue supernova. It was a quiet, suffocating death. The Anunnaki scientists and engineers, the brightest minds of their civilization, had dedicated generations to solving this problem, but all their efforts had proven fruitless. They tried everything, from building massive atmospheric scrubbers to using vast energy projectors to stabilize the planet's upper layers, but nothing worked for long. Their great cities, carved from the rock of their planet, were becoming tombs, their people's hope slowly turning to dust. In their desperation, they turned to a last-ditch, radical solution. Their scientists had discovered that fine pulverized gold, when suspended in the upper atmosphere, could act as a shield, a sort of celestial sunscreen that would reflect the harmful solar radiation and help to repair the atmospheric breach. This wasn't just any gold, but a specific type of colloidal gold, a suspension of tiny nano-sized particles. This was the one thing, the only thing, that could save them. It was the ultimate resource, more valuable than all the treasures in their gilded halls. The only problem? Their planet, Nibiru, was running out of it. The veins of gold they had been mining for millennia were now sparse and difficult to access. They needed a new source, a fresh planet rich with this life-giving element. Their astronomers and celestial navigators, poring over ancient star charts, had identified a promising candidate, a vibrant blue and white orb spinning in a nearby solar system. They called it Earth. It was a young planet, still in its geological infancy, but its surface was teeming with water, a sure sign of abundant minerals below. It was a beautiful, watery cradle of life, and for the Anunnaki, it represented their only hope. The decision to embark on this journey was not an easy one. It meant a long and perilous voyage through space, a journey of hundreds of thousands of years, according to the Sitchin chronology. The risks were astronomical. The Anunnaki leaders, including Anu, their king, and his two sons, Enki and Enlil, gathered in the High Council chambers to debate the matter. Enlil, a stern and rigid commander, argued for a full-scale colonization, a grand militaristic expedition to secure the gold at all costs. Enki, the brilliant but more compassionate scientist and master of genetic engineering, advocated for a more measured approach, a smaller expeditionary force to assess the situation before committing their entire civilization. Anu, the king and ultimate authority, listened to both his sons and eventually made a decision that would forever change the destiny of two worlds. He gave the command to build a great vessel, a massive starship capable of interstellar travel, and to assemble an elite crew of Anunnaki to make the journey. This was not a conquest. It was a rescue mission. The fate of an entire civilization, and ultimately a new one, rested on this one roll of the cosmic dice. This ancient tale, though often dismissed by mainstream scholars, provides a fascinating parallel to the stories of great migrations and quests for resources found in many human cultures. Just as nomadic tribes would brave harsh deserts for a new water source, so too did the Anunnaki embark on a journey across the ultimate desert, the cold vacuum of space, for a chance at survival. The crew was hand-picked from the most skilled and dedicated Anunnaki. They were scientists, engineers, navigators, and laborers, all united by a single, desperate purpose. Enlil, as the commander of the mission, was in charge of the day-to-day operations and the military aspect of the expedition. Enki, as the chief scientist, was responsible for the technical and logistical side, particularly the mining operation. Their relationship was already strained by a deep-seated rivalry, a quiet tension that simmered just beneath the surface of their official duties. Enki was the firstborn son, but through the traditions of his mother, Enlil was the heir apparent to the throne of Nibiru. This dynamic would play a major role in the events to come on Earth. As the great ship, a marvel of Nibiruan engineering, prepared for launch, the people of Nibiru gathered to watch. They stood in silence, a sea of solemn faces, their eyes fixed on the gleaming metal hull. They knew this was their last hope, their final gambit. As the vessel ascended into the darkening sky, a whisper of hope, fragile and uncertain, echoed through their hearts. The Anunnaki were leaving home, embarking on a voyage into the unknown to save their world, and in doing so, they would stumble upon a world that would become their new home, and the cradle of a new species they would, in a moment of desperate brilliance, create. After what must have felt like an eternity, a vast, silent journey through the cosmic dark, the Anunnaki's great ship finally reached its destination. They emerged from the inky blackness of deep space into the brilliant, life-giving light of our sun. Before them, a small, blue-green planet spun lazily on its axis, a shimmering jewel in the void. They named it Earth. Their initial reconnaissance, conducted from orbit, confirmed their hopes. The planet was incredibly rich in gold, but not just that. It was a world teeming with potential. There were vast oceans, towering mountain ranges, and sprawling continents, but the landscapes were still raw and untamed. It was a world in its geological teenage years, full of fire and fury, volcanoes spewing ash and magma, and tectonic plates groaning and shifting. It was beautiful, but also wild and dangerous. Their mission, to mine a single precious element, would have to be carried out in a world utterly different from their own, a world without the creature comforts and advanced infrastructure they were used to. They began their descent, a slow and deliberate maneuver through the planet's thick, vibrant atmosphere. The ship, a marvel of Nibiruan engineering, cut through the sky, a streak of metal against the clouds, before finally making a soft, gentle landing in a vast, swampy marshland. The chosen location was a flat, fertile plain between two great rivers, a region that would one day be known as Mesopotamia. The air was thick and humid, filled with the buzzing of insects and the calls of strange primitive animals. It was a stark contrast to the thin, dying atmosphere of Nibiru. The Anunnaki, a people who lived in sterile, controlled environments, stepped out into a world of mud, heat, and life. The first priority was to establish a base of operations, a kind of staging ground for the mining effort. They began to build their first settlement, a series of temporary structures that would one day grow into the first great city-states of Sumer. It was a monumental task, but the stakes were too high for them to fail. Their leader, Enlil, the commander of the expedition, was a stern taskmaster. He organized the workers, setting up a clear chain of command and demanding efficiency and discipline. The goal was simple: get the gold, save their world. His brother Enki, the chief scientist, was focused on a more complex problem. The gold they needed wasn't just lying on the surface. They would have to mine it from the Earth's crust, a dangerous and labor-intensive process. He began to set up the specialized equipment they had brought with them, giant drills and atmospheric converters that would one day be mistaken for mythological machines by the primitive peoples who would eventually witness them. A truly staggering amount of work lay ahead of them. The Anunnaki, a civilization accustomed to ease and automation, were now forced to do hard, manual labor in a harsh, alien environment. This struggle is a kind of cosmic mirror of the many historical migrations we know about, where people leave a familiar, failing land to brave a new, wild one in search of resources. Historians still debate whether the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia were inspired by a memory of these otherworldly settlements, or simply represented an architectural evolution of the local cultures. Their initial mining efforts began in the region now known as Southern Africa, a place rich in gold deposits. The Anunnaki established their first mining colonies there, and the work was brutal. The sun was hot, the air was thick, and the drills were loud. The lower-ranking Igigi, the worker caste of the Anunnaki, bore the brunt of this back-breaking labor. They toiled day after day, their bodies unaccustomed to such physical strain, their minds dreaming of the comfortable life they had left behind on Nibiru. The gold they were extracting was painstakingly processed and then shipped back to their base in Mesopotamia for further refinement and eventual transportation back to their home planet. This was a long-term project, not a quick smash and grab. They knew they would be on Earth for a very, very long time. As the years stretched into decades and then centuries, a quiet discontent began to brew among the Agigi workers. The promise of a quick mission was long forgotten, and the reality of their endless, toiling lives began to sink in. They were not brave explorers, they were glorified miners, trapped on a primitive planet far from home. Their resentment grew, a silent, simmering volcano waiting to erupt. The higher-ranking Anunnaki, the Anuna as they were called, seemed oblivious to their plight, focused only on the larger mission of saving Nibiru. This class divide, this chasm between the leaders and the laborers, would prove to be a major turning point in our story. It was a classic tale of the haves and the have-nots, a dynamic that would eventually lead to a full-blown rebellion and a desperate, unforeseen solution that would change the course of two planets forever. And as the Anunnaki settled in and the years went by, the seeds of a rebellion were sown not in the soil of Earth, but in the hearts of the weary and overworked. The simmering resentment among the lower-ranking Igigi workers finally boiled over. The backbreaking labor in the gold mines of southern Africa had become unbearable. They were exhausted, their morale was shot, and the endless work had begun to feel pointless. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the psychological burden of being so far from home, of toiling in a world that wasn't theirs, all for the benefit of a ruling class that seemed to have forgotten them. The tipping point came, as it so often does in these stories, with a simple act of defiance. One of the Igigi, a young Anunnaki named Alalu, simply refused to go back into the mines. He dropped his tools, stared at his supervisor, and declared that he would not work another day. Soon, others followed his lead. What began as a single act of protest quickly escalated into a full-blown rebellion. The Igigi, now a unified force, marched from the mines and gathered outside the command center, their voices a low, angry roar. They were no longer just workers, they were revolutionaries. The leaders of the Anunnaki expedition, Enlil and Enki, were completely unprepared for this turn of events. They had always seen the Igigi as a loyal, obedient workforce, a necessary cog in the machine that would save Nibiru. Now, that cog was grinding to a halt, threatening the entire mission. Enlil, the stern and uncompromising commander, was furious. He wanted to crush the rebellion with force, to make an example of the ringleaders and restore order through fear. He believed that the Igigi had forgotten their purpose, their duty to their home planet. But Enki, the compassionate scientist, saw things differently. He understood the Igigi's plight. He had watched them suffer, and a part of him sympathized with their desperation. He argued for a more diplomatic solution, a way to address their grievances without resorting to violence. This clash of ideologies, the rivalry between the two brothers, became a microcosm of the larger conflict. Enlil represented order, duty, and the rigid social structure of Nibiru. Enki represented innovation, empathy, and a willingness to break with tradition. The rebellion posed a fundamental problem that neither brother could easily solve. Without the Igigi, the mining operation would cease. Without the gold, Nibiru was doomed. The entire purpose of their long, dangerous journey to Earth was in jeopardy. This was a classic dilemma, one that has been echoed throughout human history in countless slave rebellions and labor strikes. The masters, dependent on their laborers, are forced to confront the humanity of those they have subjugated. A high council was convened in the newly established city of Eden, a place that would one day be the heart of the Sumerian civilization. The leaders of the expedition, the Anunna, sat in solemn silence, listening to the arguments of both Enlil and Enki. The fate of two worlds, Nibiru and Earth, hung in the balance. Enlil's argument was simple: enforce the law, maintain order, and get the gold. Enki's was more complex. We need a new solution, a new way to get the work done, one that doesn't rely on a resentful workforce. And that's when Enki, the master of genetic engineering, had an idea. It was a radical, audacious, and frankly, a slightly mad idea. He proposed that they create a new being, a new species that would be a perfect laborer. He had studied the primitive hominids that roamed the earth, a species he referred to as the Adamu. They were strong, resilient, and intelligent enough to follow simple commands, but they were not yet fully evolved. He proposed that they take the DNA of one of these hominids and combine it with their own to create a hybrid being that would be both a part of Earth and a part of Nibiru. This new creature would have the strength and endurance of the local hominids, but also the intelligence and obedience of a genetically engineered being. This idea, this proposal to play God with another species, was met with a mixture of shock and fascination by the other Anunna. It was a violation of their most sacred laws, a transgression against the natural order. But what was the alternative? Extinction on Nibiru? The goddess Ninti, a brilliant Anunnaki geneticist, was intrigued by Enki's plan. She was a master of her craft, and the idea of creating a new species, of playing a direct hand in the evolution of a planet, was a challenge she couldn't resist. She joined Enki in his laboratory, a place filled with humming machines and strange glowing tubes. Together, they began the long and arduous process of creating the first human. This moment, this decision to create a new species for a specific purpose, is the turning point of our story. It's the moment when the history of one world becomes intertwined with the destiny of another. Mainstream historians and archaeologists, of course, find no evidence of these extraterrestrial genetic experiments. However, they do acknowledge that the rapid technological and social leap of early human civilization in Mesopotamia, the so-called Sumerian miracle, remains a subject of ongoing debate. It's almost as if something or someone flipped a switch. The Igigi Rebellion, a small mutiny in a dusty ancient land, had led to the most profound act of creation in our entire historical narrative. With the Igigi Rebellion in full swing and the gold mining operation at a complete standstill, the Anunnaki leadership, under the intense pressure of saving their home planet, had little choice but to approve Enki's daring, almost blasphemous plan. The creation of a new species of worker was now their only viable path forward. The laboratory, a sterile and humming chamber carved into the heart of their first settlement, became the crucible for this great experiment. Enki, the brilliant scientist and geneticist, was in his element. He worked alongside the goddess Ninti, a master of her own craft, with a team of lesser-known Anunnaki who assisted in the delicate procedures. The goal was to combine the most desirable traits of the two species, the strength and hardiness of the Earth's native hominids with the intelligence and obedience of the Anunnaki themselves. It was a fusion of two worlds in the most literal sense. The process, as described in Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, was a monumental undertaking. First, they had to identify the perfect candidate among the early hominids roaming the plains. They chose a female Homo erectus, a species that was already on a trajectory toward greater intelligence and dexterity. She was, in their eyes, a blank slate, a vessel of raw potential. They carefully extracted an ovum, a pristine egg cell, from this primitive female. It was a fragile, delicate thing, a tiny piece of the future, and it represented the essence of Earth's life. Then, they took the genetic material of a young, unmarried Anunnaki male, a kind of noble volunteer, to serve as the paternal donor. This was a moment of profound significance. The very DNA of a god was being combined with the fundamental building blocks of an early human. This act, this mixture of divine and mortal, of alien and terrestrial, was something that had never been done before, and perhaps never would be again. It was a cosmic cocktail, a blend of two vastly different evolutionary paths. Enki and Ninti, with their specialized equipment, then performed the delicate procedure. They took the male Anunnaki's genetic material and carefully, precisely, infused it into the hominid egg. The challenge was immense. The two DNA structures were not naturally compatible, and they faced countless failures. Early attempts resulted in grotesque and non-viable creatures, beings that were neither one thing nor the other. They were biological dead ends, and for a while, it seemed as if the project was doomed to fail. But Enki, with his boundless intellect and determination, refused to give up. He and Ninti worked tirelessly, making small, incremental adjustments, fine-tuning the genetic code with a precision that was, to our modern sensibilities, almost unimaginable. The laboratory, once a place of sterile silence, was now filled with the low hum of machinery and the whispered conversations of the scientists, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of their equipment. This tireless effort, this struggle for perfection, is reminiscent of the countless stories of inventors and creators in our own history who toil for years to create something new, something that has never existed before. Finally, after a long period of trial and error, they had a breakthrough. They created a single, viable embryo. They decided that the best way to ensure its development was to implant it in a surrogate womb, not of a hominid, but of a high-ranking Anunnaki female. This was the most shocking part of the entire experiment. An Anunnaki goddess would carry a hybrid child, a mix of her own lineage and that of a primitive earth creature. The chosen surrogate, a compassionate and brave goddess named Mami, willingly accepted the monumental task. This act of motherhood, of carrying a life that was both alien and familiar, was the final piece of the puzzle. The gestation period was long, and the anticipation was immense. The fate of the entire Anunnaki mission, and indeed the future of Nibiru, rested on this single pregnancy. The rebellion of the Igigi, once a major threat, now seemed like a distant memory. All eyes were on Mami and the life she carried within her. This is a powerful and evocative image, a goddess nurturing a new life, a life designed for a specific purpose, a life that would change everything. The Anunnaki each had come to Earth for gold, but they were now on the brink of creating something far more valuable and far more complex, a new species with all the inherent joys, struggles, and unpredictability that life brings. The whispers among the Anunnaki were a mix of excitement and fear. They were on the verge of becoming creators, a role they had never before assumed. But they also knew that with creation comes responsibility, a responsibility they were not entirely prepared for. The scientific community, to this day, has never found direct evidence of this genetic tinkering, but we do see a sudden and rapid leap in human evolution around the time Sitchin claims this happened, a jump that still puzzles paleontologists. After a long and anxious period of gestation, the Anunnaki goddess Mami finally gave birth to the very first successful human prototype. They named this new being Adamu, which in their language meant he who is of the earth, a name that would echo through countless generations and appeared in countless myths. Adamu was a remarkable creation, a living testament to the fusion of two worlds. He possessed the raw physical strength of his hominid ancestors, but with a refined and intelligent mind. His features were a fascinating blend of the two species. The broad, sturdy frame of the early hominids combined with a more developed forehead and a deeper, more thoughtful expression in his eyes, which were a direct inheritance from the Anunnaki. He wasn't a mindless automaton. He was a being with the potential for language, for tool use, and for a kind of consciousness that his earth-based ancestors had yet to achieve. This was the moment of creation, the birth of a species that would one day wonder about its own origins, and the very first in a long line of beings who would be both master and servant to their creators. The birth of Adamu was a major turning point for the Anunnaki. He was proof that Enki's daring plan had worked, that a viable, intelligent hybrid could indeed be created. The Igigi rebellion, which had seemed like a world-ending crisis, was now a solved problem. The Anunnaki leaders, especially Enlil, who had been a skeptic, were relieved, and it must be said, a little astonished. They had gone from a state of complete desperation to a place of hope, all thanks to a single, successful genetic experiment. The creation of Adamu wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a political solution, a way to move past the labor dispute without resorting to violence. It was a compromise, a new path forward forged in the crucible of necessity. And so, the first of the Lulus, a term that would come to mean primitive worker in the Anunnaki language, had arrived. He was a being created with a purpose, to relieve his masters from the backbreaking labor of the mines. But as with all new creations, there was a learning curve. Adamu, though intelligent, was still a raw prototype. He had to be taught, guided, and trained. The Anunnaki took on the role of teachers, and in the process, they imparted some of their own knowledge to their new creation. They showed him how to use more advanced tools, how to understand and respond to simple commands, and how to perform the specific tasks required in the mining operation. This was the beginning of what would become a complex and often contradictory relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity. On the one hand, they were our creators, our masters, and our teachers. On the other hand, they saw us as a disposable workforce, a means to an end. It was a relationship built on the shaky foundation of need and exploitation, and it was bound to become more complicated as the human population grew. A parallel can be found in the many myths of divine beings creating humanity for their own service, a story that resonates in cultures across the globe, from the Mesopotamian tales of Marduk to the Greek myths of Prometheus. With the successful creation of Adamu, Enki and Ninti began to refine their process and create more of these beings. They created a female counterpart, a being to be known as Tiamat, and from these two originals, a lineage of human beings was born. The new workers were stronger, more obedient, and more adaptable to the harsh conditions of Earth than the Anunnaki themselves. They could handle the heat, the dust, and the long hours without complaint. The mining operation, which had ground to a halt, was now restarted with a new, more efficient workforce. The gold began to flow once more, and the Anunnaki could finally see a light at the end of the tunnel for their dying home planet. This was the true genesis of humanity, not in a garden, but in a laboratory, created not out of love, but out of necessity. The first of these new humans, these Lulus, were put to work in the mines of the Abzu in Africa, a region they would forever associate with their creation. They toiled, they worked, and they obeyed, unaware of the cosmic stakes of their labor. They were a blank slate, a new species with a new purpose, and in their creation, the Anunnaki had not only solved their own problem, but had also laid the groundwork for all future human civilizations. This moment, this fusion of two disparate species, is a profound mystery. While scholars today widely reject the notion of extraterrestrial intervention, the question of why human evolution accelerated so dramatically in a relatively short period is a topic of ongoing, passionate debate among scientists and historians. The Anunnaki, a people who had come to Earth for gold, had stumbled upon a resource far more potent, the ability to create. With the creation of the first human, Adamu, deemed a resounding success, Enki and Ninti were given the green light to scale up their operation. Their goal was no longer to create a single prototype, but to mass produce a new species of worker to replace the rebellious Igigi. They began to create more of these beings, refining their genetic process with each new birth. But a new problem arose. The first generation of Lulus, as they were called, were sterile. They were genetically engineered to be workers, not to procreate. This meant that the Anunnaki would have to continue the arduous process of creating each new human from scratch, a task that was not only labor-intensive, but also emotionally draining for the Anunnaki females who served as surrogates. It was a production line, but a very slow and inefficient one, and it was clear that they needed a better solution. Enki, ever the innovator, realized that for their new workforce to be truly self-sustaining, they had to be able to reproduce on their own. He and Ninti returned to the laboratory, but this time with a different goal, to give their creations the ability to procreate. This was an even more profound act of creation, a step beyond mere genetic engineering and into the realm of true life-giving. They worked to unlock the reproductive capabilities that were present in the hominid DNA, but had been suppressed during the initial genetic fusion. It was a complex and delicate process, a fine-tuning of the genetic code that went against their initial instructions. They were essentially giving their creations a piece of their own freedom, a piece of their own future, a decision that would have monumental consequences down the line. The first human to be successfully endowed with this new ability was a female named Tiamat, the first successful female worker. The name, which would later be associated with a primordial chaos monster in Mesopotamian mythology, was at this time a symbol of new life and hope. She was a being who could not only work, but could also bring forth new life, a mother to a new race. This moment was a quiet but powerful rebellion by Enki and Ninti against the cold logic of the Anunnaki Council. They had been tasked with creating a slave race, but in giving that race the power to reproduce, they had, in a way, given them the first step toward freedom. It was a gentle act of defiance, a quiet whisper of compassion in a world of stark necessity. This act of giving humanity the power to create itself is a central theme in many origin myths. Historians still argue about the true origins of the word Tiamat in ancient texts, with some linking it to the primordial sea and others to the first female figure in their creation myths. With the ability to procreate, the human population began to grow. The Anunnaki no longer needed to be the sole creators. The first humans were put to work in the mines and the newly established agricultural centers, where they began to cultivate crops and domesticate animals. The Anunnaki were now the masters of a growing, self-sustaining workforce, and the gold production was back on track. The Igigi, who had rebelled against their labor, were now put to work in other, less physically demanding tasks, and a fragile peace was restored. The grand mission to save Nibiru was back on, and the long, slow process of collecting gold continued. The new humans, now a species in their own right, thrived in the fertile land of Mesopotamia. They learned from the Anunnaki, mimicking their methods of agriculture and city building. They saw their creators as powerful, godlike figures, beings who came from the sky and who wielded unimaginable power. They worshipped them, built temples to them, and offered them sacrifices. The Anunnaki, for their part, accepted this worship, seeing it as a natural consequence of their superior status. But in the quiet moments, in the solitude of their high towers, some of the Anunnaki, like Enki, must have wondered what they had truly unleashed upon this world. They had created a species in their own image, a species with the potential for greatness, but also for conflict, for ambition, and for the kind of chaos that could one day rival their own. The newly created human species, now capable of procreation, began to multiply with a speed that startled even their Anunnaki creators. What started as a handful of Lulus quickly grew into dozens, then hundreds, and then thousands. The plains of Mesopotamia, once a wild and untamed wilderness, were now dotted with small villages and agricultural settlements. The humans, under the guidance of their Anunnaki masters, learned to farm the land, to domesticate animals, and to build simple structures. They were, in essence, becoming civilized, and their civilization was a direct reflection of the Anunnaki's influence. The Anunnaki provided the knowledge, the technology, and the leadership. The humans provided the tireless labor and the unwavering faith. It was a symbiotic relationship, but one with a deeply unbalanced power dynamic. The humans saw the Anunnaki as gods, and the Anunnaki saw the humans as a useful, albeit increasingly noisy, workforce. The human population's rapid growth was a double-edged sword for the Anunnaki. On the one hand, it meant a steady and growing source of labor for the gold mines and the agricultural fields, which in turn meant a faster and more efficient return on their investment. The mission to save Nibiru was now progressing at a pace they had only dreamed of. On the other hand, the sheer number of humans began to present new challenges. The humans were loud. They were messy. They were constantly fighting, bickering, and forming complex social structures that were difficult for the Anunnaki to manage. Enlil, the stern commander, was particularly annoyed by them. He saw them as a nuisance, a kind of cosmic pest infestation that was growing out of control. Their constant chatter and their primitive rituals disrupted the quiet, ordered existence that the Anunnaki were used to. He began to see his brother Enki's creation not as a solution, but as a new problem, a new kind of chaos that had been unleashed upon the earth. This tension, this friction between the two brothers and their differing views on humanity would become the central conflict of the next phase of the story. To manage the growing population, the Anunnaki established a system of rule. They appointed human kings and priests to act as intermediaries, to govern the human populace and ensure that the work was getting done and that the worship was being properly performed. These kings were, in essence, puppets, rulers who governed by the authority of the gods. They built magnificent ziggurats and temples, not for their own glory, but as homes and places of worship for their Anunnaki masters. This period of history, a true mainstream historical fact, saw the emergence of the first city-states in Mesopotamia, places like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, all of which would one day become the cradle of human civilization. These cities, with their organized systems of government, their intricate laws, and their highly developed cultures, are often referred to by scholars as the first true urban centers, the birthplaces of modern society. But the humans were not just simple workers. They were a curious and ambitious species. They began to question their purpose, to look up at the stars and wonder where their gods had come from. They began to develop their own complex myths and stories, weaving the Anunnaki into their own understanding of the world. They saw the rivalry between Enki and Enlil not as a simple dispute between brothers, but as a cosmic conflict between two great forces. Enki, the compassionate creator, became a kind of benevolent, life-giving god, while Enlil, the stern and demanding commander, became a god of storms and fire, a figure to be feared and placated. This is a fascinating example of how a simple historical event can be transformed into a rich and complex mythology, a process that is seen in cultures all over the world. As the years passed, the gap between the Anunnaki and their creations began to narrow in some ways. Some of the Anunnaki, and particularly Enki's lineage, took a more direct interest in human affairs, even going so far as to cohabit with human females, a practice that was strictly forbidden by Enlil. This mixing of bloodlines led to a new class of beings, a kind of demigod, a human with Anunnaki blood in their veins. These beings were stronger, smarter, and more powerful than their purely human counterparts, and they would one day become the legendary heroes and kings of ancient myth. This was a step too far for Enlil, and it would be the final straw, the last act of defiance before he decided that humanity had become too much of a problem and that a more permanent and, frankly, more brutal solution was needed. As the human population swelled and their settlements multiplied, the Anunnaki began to see the fruits of their initial plan. The gold mines were producing a steady supply. The agricultural fields were flourishing under human care, and the overall mission to save Nibiru was finally back on track. But with this success came a growing unease, especially among the more conservative Anunnaki leaders, chief among them, Enlil. The humans, once a docile and obedient workforce, were becoming a force of their own. Their villages were noisy, their social structures were complex, and their constant procreation was a source of continuous irritation for Enlil. He had, from the beginning, seen them as nothing more than a biological tool, a means to an end, and he was deeply disturbed by their increasing resemblance to the Anunnaki themselves. The humans were not only breeding, but they were also developing their own sense of identity, their own ambitions, and their own very human desires. This growing independence and ambition among the humans was fueled in part by Enki's more compassionate approach. Enki, the original creator of humanity, had a soft spot for his creations. He saw their potential, their curiosity, and their capacity for love and ingenuity. He often broke the rules set down by Enlil, teaching the humans advanced knowledge about agriculture, metallurgy, and even astronomy. He even, as we mentioned, allowed some of the Anunnaki, and even himself, to mate with human females, a move that was seen as a profound violation of the Anunnaki social order. These demigod children were a living, breathing testament to the forbidden union of two species, and they were, in a way, a symbol of Enki's quiet rebellion against his brother's rigid rules. This mingling of bloodlines and the subsequent birth of powerful demigods is a common theme in ancient mythologies, from the Greek tales of Heracles to the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, a powerful king who was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 man. But Enlil saw it all very differently. He saw the humans not as a new and promising species, but as a dangerous and unruly mob. Their noise kept him awake at night. Their constant demands for attention and guidance were a nuisance, and their growing population was, in his eyes, an unsustainable burden on the Earth's resources. He felt that Enki had gone too far, that he had given his creations too much, and that they were now a threat to the stability of the Anunnaki mission. He believed that the humans were becoming too intelligent, too ambitious, and too much like their creators, a situation that he felt could only end in conflict. He began to argue with the other Anunnaki leaders that the humans were a failed experiment, an experiment that needed to be terminated before it spiraled completely out of control. This growing animosity between the two brothers, Enlil and Enki, came to a head when a new problem arose. A great celestial body, a large rogue planet, was on a collision course with Earth. It wasn't Nibiru, which was still in a distant, stable orbit, but another, smaller planetary object that had been knocked off its course. Enlil, seeing this as an act of divine providence, a kind of cosmic reset button, proposed a radical solution to the Anunnaki Council. He argued that they should let the Great Flood, which would be caused by the celestial body's gravitational pull, wipe out all of humanity. It would be a clean slate, a chance to start over, or perhaps, in his mind, a chance to simply go home and let the earth return to its wild, untamed state. He argued that it was the only logical solution to a problem that had spiraled out of control. Enki was horrified. He saw this not as an act of divine will, but as a cold and heartless act of genocide. He pleaded with the council, reminding them that he had created these beings, that they were a part of him, and that it would be a moral crime to simply let them perish. The debate was fierce and passionate, and it was a true clash of two opposing ideologies. Enlil represented the cold, calculating logic of survival at all costs. Enki represented the compassionate, life-affirming instinct of a creator. The rest of the Anunnaki, caught between the two brothers, were in a state of deep indecision. They had a mission to save their home planet, but they also had a moral responsibility to the life they had created. And so, a decision was made. Enlil's plan was approved, but with one condition. They would not directly kill the humans. They would simply let nature take its course, and they would keep the plan a secret from all of humanity, including Enki. This silence, this conspiracy of omission, would prove to be a grave mistake. The Anunnaki had made their decision. Enlil's plan to let the coming celestial cataclysm wipe out humanity was approved, but with a cruel twist. The humans would not be warned. The Anunnaki would take to their ships, ascend to the safety of orbit, and watch as the great flood remade the world below. This was a moment of profound moral consequence, a conspiracy of silence that would forever change the relationship between the creators and their creations. But there was one Anunnaki who could not stand by and let it happen: Enki. His heart, full of a strange paternal affection for the species he had created, could not accept this cold, calculating act of genocide. He had given them life, and now his own people were going to take it away. It was a betrayal he could not abide. He knew he could not openly defy the council's decision, for to do so would mean punishment and a potential civil war among the Anunnaki themselves. He had to act in secret, in the quiet shadows, a quiet rebellion of his own. He sought out a man named Utnapishtim, a loyal and wise human who served as a kind of high priest in the city of Shuruppak. Utnapishtim was a man of great faith, a devout servant of the Anunnaki, and a kind and compassionate leader of his people. Enki knew he could trust him, but how could he warn him without directly disobeying the council's decree? He couldn't just walk up to him and say, "Hey, a giant flood is coming, and my brother Enlil is going to let you all die." That would be a direct violation of his orders. So he devised a clever plan, a way to convey the warning without speaking a single forbidden word. The story, as found in the ancient texts, says that Enki spoke to Utnapishtim not directly, but through a reed wall. He stood on one side of the wall, and pretending to speak to the wall itself, he whispered the secret to the man on the other side. Reed wall, listen carefully to my words," he said. "Man of Shuruppak, tear down your house and build a great boat. A great flood will come and wipe out all of mankind. You must save your family and the seed of all living things." This was his way of giving the warning without being seen to have given the warning, a kind of cosmic, plausible deniability. Utnapishtim, a man of profound faith, heard the words, and knew they were from his god, Enki. He immediately began to follow the instructions, a desperate race against time. He tore down his house, gathered the timber, and began to build a massive ark, a vessel unlike anything the world had ever seen. The other humans, seeing Utnapishtim tearing down his house for no apparent reason, thought he had gone mad. They mocked him, laughed at him, and questioned his sanity. But Utnapishtim, with the unwavering conviction of a man who knows the truth, simply ignored them and continued his work. He loaded the ark with his family, his friends, a few artisans he trusted, and most importantly, pairs of every living creature he could find. He gathered the seeds of every plant and the eggs of every bird, a kind of biological backup drive for all of Earth's life. This story, a true and well-known historical narrative, is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, a much older text than the biblical story of Noah. It is a stunning example of how a single event can echo through history and be retold in different cultures and different times, each time with a slightly different hero and a slightly different moral. Enki's act of rebellion was not without consequences. He was a god, but he was also a brother, and his brother, Enlil, would soon find out about his betrayal. For now, however, the secret was safe, and the great ark was being built in silence, a testament to one God's quiet compassion and one man's unwavering faith. The humans, still toiling in the fields and living their lives, were oblivious to their impending doom. They were like ants on a picnic blanket, unaware of the giant boot that was about to descend upon them. Their laughter and their daily routines were a cruel and ironic counterpoint to the quiet, desperate work of Utnapishtim. They continued to live, to love, and to fight, completely ignorant of the fact that their time was almost up. And so, the stage was set. The great flood was coming. The Anunnaki were preparing to ascend to the safety of their ships. Utnapishtim was nearing completion of his great vessel. The entire fate of humanity rested on the shoulders of one man and the quiet defiance of one God. It was a story of hope and betrayal, of creation and destruction, and of the profound consequences of playing God. The ancient world, a place of gods and myths, was about to be remade, and the humans, who were supposed to be a simple workforce, were about to prove that they were far more resilient and far more beloved by at least one of their creators than anyone could have ever imagined. The time had finally come. The great celestial body, a rogue planet, or a massive comet, depending on which interpretation you follow, drew closer to Earth. Its immense gravitational pull began to wreak havoc on our planet. The tides rose to unimaginable heights. The Earth's crust groaned and buckled, and a deep, low rumble echoed across the land. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now a roiling mass of dark, angry clouds. The Anunnaki, the gods of this world, watched from the safety of their starships, a fleet of great vessels hovering in high orbit. They were silent, observers of the cataclysm they had chosen to allow. This was Enlil's plan in motion, a grim solution to the problem of humanity. He watched the world below with a kind of grim satisfaction, believing he was restoring order to a chaotic world. Down on Earth, the great deluge began. Rain, of a kind that had never been seen before, fell from the sky in sheets, a torrent of water that blotted out the sun and the stars. The oceans, now a furious, churning maelstrom, rose over the land, swallowing mountains and cities alike. The humans, caught completely unaware, screamed in terror as their world was torn apart. They ran, they cried, and they desperately tried to find higher ground, but there was nowhere to go. The water was everywhere, a vast, hungry force that consumed everything in its path. In their final moments, they looked up at the sky, not with anger, but with a kind of profound, heartbreaking confusion. They had served their gods, they had worshipped them, and now their gods were watching them die. This was the dark climax of Enlil's plan, a moment of profound and absolute destruction. But in the midst of this chaos, one man and his family were safe. Utnapishtim, guided by the secret words of Enki, was aboard his great ark, a small wooden vessel tossed about like a toy on a furious sea. Inside, his family and the animals he had saved were safe and sound, a small pocket of life in a world of death. The ark, a masterpiece of ancient engineering, was waterproof, sturdy, and well provisioned. Utnapishtim, a man of simple faith and unwavering conviction, looked out from a small window and saw the destruction, and his heart was filled with a profound sadness. He mourned for the people who had mocked him, for the homes that had been washed away, and for the entire world that had been unmade. He knew that this was a cleansing, a great reset, but it was also a great tragedy and a terrible price to pay for the actions of a few angry gods. This scene, a lone boat surviving a great flood, is a powerful and resonant image, one that has been echoed in countless cultures and religions, from the stories of Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology to the great flood narratives of the Maya and the Aztecs. The fact that this story is so universal is a fascinating scholarly debate, with some arguing for a common source and others for independent development in response to similar geological events. As the flood raged on, it was not just the humans who were in peril. The very infrastructure of the Anunnaki on Earth was being destroyed. Their settlements, their mines, and their laboratories were all being submerged and ripped apart by the relentless water. The gold they had painstakingly gathered for centuries was now buried under a mountain of mud and silt. Their entire mission, their entire reason for being on this planet was in jeopardy. Up in the safety of their ships, the Anunnaki watched with a mixture of relief and horror. They had survived, but at what cost? Enlil, the architect of this great purge, may have felt a fleeting sense of vindication, but he must have also felt a deep sense of loss. He had not only wiped out a species, he had also destroyed his own civilization's foothold on the planet. And as the storm finally began to subside, as the waters began to recede, a new world, a stark and desolate landscape of mud and debris, was revealed. There were no cities, no farms, no people, save for one small ark bobbing on the vast empty sea. The Anunnaki, peering down from their ships, must have felt a strange kind of loneliness, a profound sense of isolation. Their grand, chaotic experiment was over, and they had succeeded, but in their success, they had created a silent, empty world. The age of humanity, as they had created it, was over, but the story of humanity, thanks to the quiet rebellion of Enki and the unwavering faith of Utnapishtim, was about to begin anew. As the great waters finally began to recede, a new world, a vast and desolate landscape of mud and silence was revealed. The mighty rivers had changed their courses, the mountains were scoured clean, and the once vibrant plains were now a vast gray wasteland. The Anunnaki, watching from their orbiting ships, finally descended, their vessels touching down on a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. They were a people who had come to a lush paradise and were now returning to a desolate wilderness. Their grand experiment with humanity was, in their minds, over. They believed that the slate had been wiped clean, and they were ready to start over, to rebuild their infrastructure and continue the mission of mining gold, this time without the nuisance of the noisy human population. Enlil, the stern and unyielding commander, was the first to land. He surveyed the wreckage of the world he had unmade with a kind of grim satisfaction. He saw it not as a tragedy, but as a necessary purification, a reset button for a project that had gone wrong. But his satisfaction was short-lived. A few of the other Anunnaki, landing their own small shuttlecrafts, began to detect a strange anomaly. A small pocket of life, a tiny sliver of humanity, had survived. A search was launched, and to Enlil's utter shock and fury, he discovered Utnapishtim's Ark, a small wooden vessel resting on the peak of a newly formed mountain. Utnapishtim, his family, and a precious menagerie of animals had survived the flood. Enlil was enraged. He had given a direct order, a decree that no human should be warned, and yet here they were, a living, breathing testament to his brother's profound disobedience. He confronted Enki, his face a mask of furious betrayal. "Who told them?" he roared. "Who dared to defy my will and save these creatures?" Enki, in a moment of quiet dignity, simply confessed. "I did," he said. "I spoke not to them, but to a reed wall. It was not a man I spoke to, but a wall." It was a clever but transparent play on words, and Enlil was not amused. But as he looked at Utnapishtim, the man who had survived, and at his family, he saw not a rebellious slave, but a being of profound resilience and unwavering faith. The human, who had been created as a worker, had proven that he was something more. He was a survivor, a keeper of life, and the last remnant of a species that refused to be extinguished. The other Anunnaki, seeing Enlil's rage and Enki's quiet defiance, were caught in the middle. They were torn between the rigid law of their commander and the compassionate actions of their creator. In the end, a compromise was reached. Enlil, seeing that the total eradication of humanity was not only impossible, but also perhaps morally wrong, relented. He agreed that Utnapishtim and his family could live, but on one condition: they would be taken to a new land, far away from the Anunnaki settlements, where they could live in peace and solitude. And so, Utnapishtim and his family were taken to the eastern lands, a place that would one day be known as Dilmun, a kind of paradise. Enlil also, as a further act of concession and as a kind of punishment for Enki, elevated Utnapishtim to the status of a demigod, granting him a kind of immortality. He would live forever, a lonely keeper of the flame of humanity, a living reminder of the great flood and the profound betrayal that preceded it. With Utnapishtim and his family now safe, the Anunnaki turned their attention back to their mission. The gold was still buried, and the task of rebuilding was immense. The rebellion of the Igigi was now a distant memory, and the need for a new workforce was more pressing than ever. So, with the floodwaters finally gone and a new, desolate world stretched out before them, the Anunnaki began to search for the remnants of their creations, for any humans who might have survived the flood in some forgotten cave or on some remote high-altitude peak. This was the beginning of the second age of humanity, an age that would be defined by the hard, back-breaking work of rebuilding a world that had been unmade and the quiet, complex relationship between the creators and their creations. This return to the original purpose, the need for a labor force, is a powerful example of how necessity drives invention, even on a cosmic scale. The Great Flood had scoured the earth, but it hadn't completely wiped out humanity. A few scattered pockets of survivors, people who had found shelter in high-altitude caves or on the peaks of newly formed mountains, had managed to cling to life. These were not the organized, city-dwelling humans of before. They were wild, primal survivors, a kind of biological fossil from a lost era. The Anunnaki, desperate for a workforce to rebuild their shattered infrastructure and restart the gold mining operation, began to search for them. They found them in small, nomadic tribes, living in fear and ignorance of the world that had been. The humans, at seeing the Anunnaki descend from the sky, thought they were ghosts or avenging spirits. They were terrified, but also desperate for guidance and help. Enki, once again taking on the role of compassionate creator, decided that this new generation of humans should be given a fresh start. He gathered them together, taught them to plant crops from the seeds that Utnapishtim had saved, and showed them how to domesticate the wild animals that had survived the flood. He taught them the basics of farming, of herding, and of building simple shelters. It was a rapid, accelerated course in civilization, a crash course in how to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. The humans, with their newfound knowledge, began to rebuild. They were no longer just workers. They were farmers and herders, a self-sustaining populace that could now provide for themselves and, more importantly, for the Anunnaki. But the most significant thing Enki did was to teach them a new way to communicate. The original humans had a single unified language, a simple tongue taught to them by their creators. The new humans, isolated from one another in their small tribes, had developed their own primitive dialects, but they were still able to communicate with one another with a kind of a simplified universal language. However, the Anunnaki were wary of a unified human populace. They feared that a single, powerful human civilization could one day challenge their authority, just as the Igigi had done. The memory of the rebellion was still fresh in their minds, so they decided to introduce a new element into the human experience, the division of language. This brings us to one of the most famous and debated stories in history, one that is often dismissed as a simple myth, but which in this telling takes on a new, more sinister meaning. The story of the Tower of Babel. According to the Sitchin interpretation, the humans, now a large and growing population, began to build a massive ziggurat, a kind of launch tower that they believed would allow them to reach the sky and communicate directly with their gods. They were a unified people working together for a common purpose, and this unity, this ambition, was a direct threat to the Anunnaki's rule. They saw it as a kind of second rebellion, a silent but potent act of defiance. Enlil, seeing this monument to human ambition, was furious. He argued that the humans had to be stopped, that their unity was a danger to the Anunnaki and their mission. He, along with other high-ranking Anunnaki, decided to take direct action. They descended to the earth, and using their advanced technology, they confused their language, scrambling the unified tongue of the humans into a cacophony of different dialects. The humans, unable to communicate with one another, descended into chaos. The building of the great ziggurat stopped. The people, now strangers to one another, scattered across the land, forming different tribes, cultures, and nations. This simple act of linguistic sabotage had a profound and lasting effect on human history. It created the cultural and linguistic diversity that we see in the world today, but it was born not out of natural evolution, but out of a deliberate, calculated act of control by a race of alien masters. This moment, this division of language, marks a turning point in the story of humanity. We were no longer a single, unified people, but a collection of diverse cultures, each with its own language, its own myths, and its own unique identity. The Anunnaki had, in a single stroke, solved the problem of a unified human populace, but in doing so, they had also laid the groundwork for all future human conflicts, for all the wars and misunderstandings that would be born from the simple fact that we could no longer understand one another. And so, the story of humanity, which had started with a single, unified purpose, now splintered into a million different paths, each one leading away from our common origin and into a future of profound and beautiful but also tragic diversity. With the humans scattered and their languages confused, the Anunnaki felt a fragile sense of control return. The threat of a unified human populace, a second rebellion like the one that had crippled their mission before, was now a distant memory. But the rivalry between the two great Anunnaki brothers, Enki and Enlil, was far from over. In fact, it only intensified. The Earth, once a single unified territory under their shared command, was now divided, and each brother began to claim a piece of it for himself and his lineage. The conflict, which had been simmering beneath the surface since their arrival, now burst into the open, a quiet but profound cosmic Cold War. Enlil, as the leader of the expedition and the traditional heir to the throne of Nibiru, claimed the most fertile land, the vast plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the place that would one day be known as Mesopotamia. This was the heart of their first settlements, the cradle of their mission, and Enlil, with his rigid sense of order and command, saw it as his rightful domain. He established his command center in the great city of Nippur and began to rebuild the Anunnaki infrastructure with the help of the scattered human tribes he had gathered. He saw himself as the rightful ruler of this new post-flood world, and he expected absolute obedience, not just from the humans, but from his brother as well. Enki, on the other hand, the compassionate creator and master of engineering, took the more remote and resource-rich lands. He established his domain in the south, in the fertile delta region that would become the heart of the Sumerian civilization, centered around the city of Eridu. He saw his role not as a commander, but as a teacher and a guide. He continued to work closely with the humans, teaching them new skills, new forms of agriculture, and new ways to live in this harsh new world. His rule was more benevolent, more paternal, and the humans who lived under his care saw him as a kind and wise protector, a stark contrast to the stern and demanding Enlil. This division of territory and ideology created a kind of spiritual and political split among the human populace as well. The humans under Enlil's rule were taught to be obedient and to worship him as a stern, all-powerful deity. The humans under Enki's rule were taught to be more independent and to worship him as a wise and benevolent creator. The conflict between the two brothers and their respective lineages became the central theme of the next phase of the Anunnaki presence on Earth. It was a struggle for power and influence, a battle waged not with swords and armies, but with the quiet manipulation of human affairs. The sons of Enlil and the sons of Enki, a new generation of Anunnaki rulers, inherited their father's rivalry and began to vie for control of the different city-states and regions. This is a classic historical parallel, a kind of cosmic version of the political rivalries that have driven so many human conflicts, from the Peloponnesian War to the Cold War. Historians still argue about the true nature of the rivalries between the various Mesopotamian city-states. Some see them as purely political and economic, while others see hints of an underlying divine conflict, a kind of celestial puppet show being played out on a human stage. The Anunnaki had come to Earth as a single, unified force with a single, unified mission. But the pressures of the long journey, the challenges of a new world, and the unforeseen consequences of their genetic experiment had splintered them into two warring factions. The gold was still being mined. The mission was still technically a success, but the cost was now a deep-seated and dangerous division among the very beings who were in charge of it all. And as the Anunnaki began to wage their own quiet war, the humans, the new, divided and confused humanity they had created, were caught in the middle, a pawn in a game they barely understood. This dynamic of humans being caught in a power struggle between their gods is a theme that would echo throughout the history of every major religion and mythology, a testament to the powerful but often tragic nature of our relationship with the divine. With the two factions of Anunnaki, led by Enlil and Enki, now in a state of quiet but profound rivalry, the stage was set for the next great act in this cosmic drama, the rise of Sumer. The Anunnaki, realizing that they needed a more permanent and organized presence on Earth, began to build magnificent cities, not just as temporary command centers, but as true, lasting homes. The area between the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, became their domain, a land that would forever be known as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. This was where they truly settled in, where they began to lay the foundations for what we now know as human civilization. The Anunnaki, a people of immense intelligence and technological prowess, taught humanity everything they knew. They were the ultimate teachers, and the humans, their creations, were eager students. Under the guidance of the Anunnaki, the humans began to build the first true city-states. Places like Uruk, Eridu, and Ur sprang up, not as simple collections of huts, but as organized, sprawling urban centers with complex systems of governance, religion, and commerce. The Anunnaki taught the humans how to irrigate the land, to control the flow of the rivers, and to farm on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the post-flood survivors. They introduced advanced agricultural techniques, domesticated animals, and taught them the art of metalworking, an act that would one day lead to the Bronze Age. But perhaps the most profound and lasting gift they gave to humanity was the gift of writing. The Anunnaki taught the humans how to inscribe their thoughts and their histories onto clay tablets, a system we now know as cuneiform. This was not a random act of kindness. It was a necessary tool for managing a growing and complex society. They needed a way to keep track of their harvests, their resources, and their laws, and in teaching the humans how to write, they gave them the very first tool of recorded history. Mainstream historians and archaeologists, while rejecting the alien intervention theory, point to the Sumerian miracle, a sudden and dramatic leap in human technology and culture that remains one of the great mysteries of our past. The new human civilization, with its bustling cities and its intricate systems of governance, was not a utopia. It was a place of profound social stratification. At the top of the social pyramid were the Anunnaki themselves, the gods who ruled from their ziggurat temples. They were the ultimate authority, the source of all knowledge and power. Below them were the human kings and priests who acted as intermediaries, passing down the laws and decrees of the gods and managing the day-to-day affairs of the human populace. At the bottom were the vast majority of the population, the farmers, the artisans, and the laborers, the ones who toiled to make the entire system work. This was a direct, top-down form of governance, a kind of theocratic monarchy, and it was a direct reflection of the Anunnaki's own social structure. The kings, who ruled over the city-states, were not seen as absolute rulers in their own right. They were seen as representatives of the gods, mortals who were given a divine right to rule. Their power was not their own. It was a reflection of the Anunnaki's power, and their legitimacy was derived from their close relationship with their divine masters. This is a recurring theme throughout ancient history, a kind of historical fact where the legitimacy of a ruler is often tied to their perceived connection to the divine. The kings of Sumer were no different. They were the shepherds of the human flock, but the ultimate shepherd was always the Anunnaki, watching over them from their temples and their starships. And so, the New World, a world reborn from the ashes of the Great Flood, began to flourish. The Anunnaki, once a small and desperate group of miners, were now the rulers of a vast and complex civilization. The humans, once a simple workforce, were now the inheritors of an immense and powerful legacy. The gold was still being mined. The mission to save Nibiru was still the ultimate goal, but something else had happened. The Anunnaki had not only created a new species, they had also created a new world, a world that was now a blend of their own culture and the raw, wild spirit of Earth. This new civilization, Sumer, would one day become the foundation for all future civilizations, a legacy that would echo throughout history long after its creators had departed. The rise of the great Sumerian city-states, under the direct tutelage of the Anunnaki, marked a new era. It was a golden age of sorts, where humanity, once a scattered group of primitive survivors, was now a powerful and organized civilization. But this rapid ascent was not without its complexities. The relationship between the Anunnaki and their human creations began to evolve into something far more nuanced than a simple master-slave dynamic. The humans, now with a sense of culture, a sense of history, and a system of writing, began to see their creators in a new light. They were still gods, yes, but they were also a kind of extended family, a group of powerful, often squabbling beings who had a direct hand in their daily lives. The Anunnaki, for their part, also saw the humans differently. They were no longer just a workforce. They were now a kind of project, a living, breathing testament to their own ingenuity. This newfound intimacy led to a unique and often contradictory social structure. While the Anunnaki largely kept to themselves and their towering ziggurats, a new class of beings, the demigods, began to emerge. These were the offspring of the Anunnaki and human females, a forbidden union that Enlil had tried to prevent, but which Enki had, in his compassion, secretly allowed. These demigods were a fascinating blend of the two species. They possessed the immense strength and intelligence of their Anunnaki parents, but also the emotional depth and mortality of their human mothers. They were, in a way, the bridge between the two worlds, a living, breathing testament to the profound connection between the creators and their creations. These beings were not seen as freaks or outcasts. They were revered as heroes, as kings, and as leaders. The most famous of them all, the legendary King Gilgamesh, was said to be 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a physical embodiment of this complex and often contradictory new reality. These demigods became the rulers of the city-states, the great kings who would one day lead humanity to its own destiny. They were the intermediaries between the gods and the people, the ones who could speak to both worlds and who could understand the needs of both. Their rule was seen as divinely ordained, and their lineage was a source of immense pride. The royal dynasties of Sumer were not based on conquest or inheritance alone. They were based on a perceived connection to the divine, a bloodline that could be traced back to the Anunnaki themselves. This is a common theme in many ancient cultures, a kind of historical fact, where the legitimacy of a king is often tied to their connection to the gods. But in the case of Sumer, this connection was not just a myth, it was a reality, a direct consequence of a forbidden union. This new reality, however, also brought with it a new source of tension. The conflict between Enlil and Enki, which had been a quiet rivalry between two brothers, now began to play out on a human stage. The demigod children of Enlil's lineage and the demigod children of Enki's lineage began to vie for power, each one believing that they were the rightful rulers of the world. The city-states, which were once unified under a single Anunnaki authority, now began to fracture along these new lines, with each city-state pledging allegiance to a different divine patron. The rivalries that would one day lead to wars and conflicts between the various Sumerian city-states were not just political or economic in nature. They were a reflection of a deeper, more profound, and more cosmic conflict between the Anunnaki themselves. The humans, for their part, were caught in the middle. They were a pawn in a game they barely understood, a game of cosmic politics and divine rivalry. They were given immense knowledge and power, but they were also burdened with the sins of their creators. The Golden Age of Sumer, a time of immense progress and prosperity, was built on a foundation of profound instability, a foundation that would one day crumble under the weight of its own internal conflicts. The Anunnaki had given humanity the keys to civilization, but they had also, in their own petty rivalries, given them the seeds of their own destruction. And as the great cities of Sumer flourished and the demigods ruled from their gilded thrones, a storm was brewing, a storm that would one day tear apart not just the human world, but the very fabric of the Anunnaki's presence on Earth. The Golden Age of Sumer, a time of unprecedented growth and prosperity, was built on a foundation of divine rivalry. The two great Anunnaki brothers, Enki and Enlil, and their respective children were now locked in a fierce, multi-generational power struggle. This was no longer a quiet disagreement. It was an open conflict for the soul of the earth and the future of humanity. The humans, once a simple workforce, were now caught in the crossfire, their loyalties and their lives being pulled in different directions. The sons of Enki, who saw themselves as the benevolent protectors of humanity, and the sons of Enlil, who saw themselves as the rightful rulers, were now using the human city-states as their battleground. The great Sumerian cities, once symbols of unity and progress, were now symbols of division and conflict, each one a kind of cosmic pawn in a celestial game of chess. This period of history is marked by a series of wars between the city-states, conflicts that historians still argue about. Were they simple territorial disputes, or were they a reflection of a deeper, more profound, and more divine conflict? The tensions reached a boiling point with the discovery of the ultimate weapon, nuclear fission. The Anunnaki, with their advanced technology, had been using a kind of nuclear power for centuries to fuel their starships and their settlements. But the knowledge of how to weaponize it had always been a closely guarded secret, a kind of cosmic taboo. However, in their desperation and their rage, the two factions began to develop and deploy these weapons against one another. This was the point of no return, the moment where the quiet rivalry became an open and incredibly dangerous war. The first target was not a human city, but the Anunnaki spaceport, a kind of cosmic airport where their ships landed and took off. This spaceport, located in the Sinai Peninsula, was a strategic target, and its destruction would cripple one of the factions and give the other a decisive advantage. The battle for the spaceport was a terrible and destructive affair, a kind of cosmic Armageddon, where advanced weapons of unimaginable power were unleashed upon the earth. The result was a profound and irreversible catastrophe. The spaceport was destroyed, but the collateral damage was immense. A great radioactive cloud, a kind of cosmic fallout, was released into the atmosphere, a silent, deadly killer that began to drift across the land. The wind, which in the ancient texts is described as a terrible storm from the east, carried this cloud of death across the once fertile plains of Mesopotamia, the very heart of the Sumerian civilization. The cities, the farms, and the people were all engulfed in this cloud of radiation, a silent, unseen killer that brought a swift and terrible end to the Golden Age. The ancient city of Ur, a magnificent and powerful city, was hit particularly hard, and the ancient texts describe it as being a ruin of desolation, a place where the people fell silent in their heaps. This was the Great Cataclysm, the moment when the Anunnaki's grand experiment with humanity came to a tragic and violent end. The humans, who had been created to serve, were now being destroyed as a consequence of their creator's own sins. The Anunnaki, watching in horror from their ships, must have felt a profound sense of shame and loss. They had come to Earth to save their own world, but in their greed and their rivalry, they had destroyed this new one. The Golden Age was over, the cities were in ruins, and the magnificent civilization they had helped to create was now a ghost, a memory etched in clay. This event is a powerful and unsettling parallel to the modern fear of nuclear war, a kind of cosmic cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the ultimate price of conflict. The destruction of Ur, a truly historical event, is a well-documented fact, but the cause of its demise is still a subject of scholarly debate. And as the great radioactive cloud settled over the land, a deep silence, a kind of cosmic quiet, fell over the earth. The laughter of the children, the chatter of the farmers, and the songs of the priests were all gone, replaced by the silent hum of radiation and the mournful wail of the wind. The humans, who had been a symbol of hope and progress, were now a symbol of loss and destruction. The Anunnaki had succeeded in their mission to save their world, but in doing so, they had destroyed their own new home, and the legacy they had left behind was a profound and terrible one. The Great Cataclysm, the nuclear event that had laid waste to the heart of Sumer, had a profound and irreversible effect on the Anunnaki. Their two main factions, led by Enki and Enlil, were now left to deal with the devastating aftermath of their own conflict. The great cities they had helped build were now radioactive ruins. The human populace was decimated, and their mission to mine gold was, for all intents and purposes, over. The very ground they had stood upon was now poisoned, and the air was filled with a silent, invisible killer. The golden age of Sumer, a time of immense progress and cooperation, had ended in a blaze of cosmic fury, and all that remained was a vast, desolate wasteland. This was the turning point, the moment where the Anunnaki, who had come as saviors, realized they had become destroyers. With their grand project in ruins and their mission in tatters, the Anunnaki began to withdraw. The Earth was no longer a thriving colony, but a dangerous and toxic environment. The gold they had painstakingly mined for centuries was now a lost cause, buried under a mountain of radioactive debris. The cost of staying, of trying to rebuild in this toxic new world, was simply too high. They began to dismantle their remaining infrastructure, to pack up their advanced technology, and to prepare for a long and mournful journey home. This was not a triumphant departure. It was a retreat, a quiet and shameful exodus from a world they had broken. The humans, a few scattered survivors in the remote corners of the globe, watched in a kind of profound, heartbreaking confusion as their gods abandoned them. The Anunnaki, who had given them life and knowledge, were now leaving them to fend for themselves in a ruined, toxic world. But even in their departure, the rivalry between Enlil and Enki continued. Enlil, the stern and uncompromising commander, argued that the humans had been a mistake from the beginning, and that it was best to simply leave them to their fate. He saw their survival as a kind of cosmic defiance, a final, frustrating remnant of Enki's betrayal. He wanted to leave Earth and never look back, to return to Nibiru and try to rebuild their own failing world, leaving humanity to slowly die out. Enki, however, the compassionate creator, could not bear to leave his creations to their fate. He argued that they had a moral responsibility to the humans, that they had to give them one last chance, one last gift before they left. This was a profound philosophical debate, a clash of two opposing worldviews: the cold, calculating logic of survival and the warm, compassionate logic of creation. In the end, Enki prevailed, but the compromise was a bitter one. They would not take the humans with them, for that was impossible. Instead, they would leave behind a legacy of knowledge and guidance, a kind of cosmic instruction manual that would allow humanity to rebuild on its own. They would appoint new human leaders, kings, and priests who would not be just puppets, but true rulers who would guide their people into a new post-Anunnaki era. They would leave behind the knowledge of agriculture, of writing, and of the fundamental laws of civilization. They would, in essence, set humanity on a path to its own destiny, a path that was not reliant on their direct intervention. This was a gift born of profound guilt and regret, a final act of atonement for the sins of the Anunnaki. It was a kind of historical fact, a kind of scholarly debate, that the sudden and dramatic rise of post-Sumerian civilizations like the Akkadians and the Babylonians was fueled by a kind of inherited knowledge, a legacy left behind by a forgotten people. And so the Anunnaki departed. Their great ships, once symbols of hope and progress, were now symbols of a profound and tragic farewell. They rose into the sky, a silent, mournful fleet, and left the earth to its own fate. The humans, the few scattered survivors, watched them go, and in their hearts, a deep sense of loss and abandonment was born. Their gods had left them, and they were now alone in a ruined world. But they were not without hope. The legacy of the Anunnaki, the knowledge and the guidance they had left behind, was a powerful and enduring gift. It was a gift that would allow humanity to rebuild, to create its own civilizations, and to forge its own destiny. A destiny that was no longer tied to the whims and the rivalries of their alien creators. The story of humanity, which had been a story of dependence, was now a story of profound and beautiful independence. The Anunnaki's departure left a profound and lasting void on Earth. The great ziggurats and temples, once bustling centers of divine activity, were now silent, their halls empty and their secrets locked away. The humans, a few scattered survivors in a world that was both new and old, were now on their own. They were no longer a workforce for their creators. They were a species with a destiny of its own. But the Anunnaki had not left them completely helpless. They had, in their final act of atonement, left behind a powerful legacy, a kind of cultural and technological DNA that would allow humanity to rise from the ashes of the Great Flood and the nuclear cataclysm. This legacy, a rich tapestry of myth, knowledge, and technology, would become the foundation for all future human civilizations. The most immediate and tangible legacy was the knowledge of writing, agriculture, and metallurgy. The humans, who had been taught these skills by their creators, now had the tools to rebuild their world. The knowledge of how to irrigate the land, to grow crops in a sustainable way, and to work with metals like bronze and copper was not a natural evolutionary development. It was a gift, a kind of cosmic head start. This sudden and dramatic leap in human technology is a well-documented historical fact, and it is a source of great debate among scholars. Some argue that it was a natural development, a kind of human ingenuity blossoming after a period of intense pressure. Others, following the Anunnaki narrative, see it as a direct inheritance, a legacy left behind by a forgotten people. The humans, now armed with this knowledge, began to rebuild their cities, to form new nations, and to establish new cultures. This was the birth of the post-Sumerian civilizations, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, all of which would one day rise to prominence in the land of Mesopotamia. But the most enduring legacy of the Anunnaki was not a material one, it was a spiritual one. The myths and legends of the Anunnaki, the stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the great flood, and their eventual departure were not forgotten. They were passed down from generation to generation, woven into the very fabric of human religion and mythology. The Anunnaki, who had been their gods, were now their ancestors, their creators, and the source of all their knowledge. The stories of their conflicts, their compassion, and their cruelty became the basis for a new kind of human religion, a religion that was a direct reflection of their alien creators. The humans, in their attempts to understand their own origins, looked back at the stories of their divine ancestors and created a new kind of spiritual framework, one that was a blend of fear, reverence, and a profound sense of abandonment. The rivalry between Enki and Enlil, which had been a tragic, world-ending conflict, was now reinterpreted as a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between order and chaos. Enki, the compassionate creator, was now seen as a kind of benevolent, life-giving God, the one who had saved humanity from the great flood and who had given them the tools to rebuild. Enlil, the stern and uncompromising commander, was now seen as a kind of vengeful, wrathful God, the one who had tried to destroy humanity and who had brought about the great cataclysm. This dualism, this profound and fundamental split between the two great forces of the universe, became a central theme in many human religions and mythologies, a kind of philosophical echo of the Anunnaki's own internal conflicts. And so, the humans began their new journey. They were no longer a dependent species, but an independent one, a species that was now free to forge its own destiny, to make its own mistakes, and to create its own legacy. The Anunnaki had left, but their shadow remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. Their stories were now our stories, their myths were now our myths, and their legacy was now our own. The memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, was not forgotten. It was simply transformed, and in its transformation, it became the foundation for all that would come after. The legacy of the Anunnaki was not a tombstone. It was a seed that would one day blossom into the rich and complex tapestry of human civilization. After the great cataclysm and the subsequent departure of the Anunnaki, the surviving human populations began the long, hard work of rebuilding. The world they inherited was a vast, desolate place, but it was not without hope. The Anunnaki had left behind a rich legacy of knowledge, and the human kings and priests, the new leaders of a leaderless world, began to use that knowledge to forge a new destiny. The memory of the Anunnaki was still fresh, but it was no longer a living presence. It was now a ghost, a myth, a powerful story that would shape the human psyche for millennia to come. The humans, now freed from the direct control of their creators, began to create their own civilizations, their own empires, and their own histories. The land of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of humanity and the site of its tragic downfall, once again became the cradle of civilization. The Anunnaki's home planet, Nibiru, which had been the entire reason for their long and arduous journey to Earth, was now a lost legend, a kind of cosmic Atlantis. The humans, who had never seen the planet with their own eyes, only knew it from the stories passed down by their Anunnaki ancestors. The stories described it as a great, red, winged planet, a celestial body that had an elliptical orbit that brought it close to Earth every few thousand years. They called it the planet of the crossing, a kind of cosmic omen that signaled a time of great change and great upheaval. This mythical planet, whose existence is still a subject of passionate debate among astronomers and conspiracy theorists, became a central theme in human mythology and eschatology. It was a kind of cosmic clock, a timer that was slowly counting down to a future event, a time when the gods would return and either save or destroy humanity. The belief in a returning powerful celestial body is a common theme in many ancient prophecies, from the Mayan calendar to the Book of Revelation, and it is a testament to the powerful and lasting influence of the Anunnaki narrative. The search for Nibiru, a pursuit that began as a desperate mission for the Anunnaki, became a kind of cosmic obsession for a small but dedicated group of modern-day scholars and theorists. They pore over ancient texts, looking for clues, for hints, and for any shred of evidence that would prove the existence of this mythical planet. They argue that the reason we haven't found it yet is because its orbit is so vast and so elliptical that it spends most of its time in the cold, dark void of deep space, a ghost planet that only appears once every 3,600 years. This theory, which is widely dismissed by mainstream astronomers, is a powerful and compelling one, and it is a direct consequence of the Anunnaki narrative. It is a testament to the idea that there is more to our history than we have been told, that the myths and legends of the past are not just stories, but a kind of hidden truth waiting to be discovered. The Anunnaki had come to Earth for gold, but they had also, in their own petty conflicts and their own profound mistakes, created a new species, a new world, and a new mythology. They had left, but their shadow remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the great flood, and their eventual departure were now our stories, and in those stories we saw a reflection of ourselves. We saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And as the human civilizations rose and fell, and as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth, became more and more a part of our own history, a kind of cosmic origin story that we could never quite shake. The search for Nibiru, for the lost home of our creators, is a powerful metaphor for our own search for meaning, for our own desire to understand our origins. We look up at the stars and we wonder, are we alone? Are we the result of a random cosmic accident? Or are we the result of a deliberate act of creation? The Anunnaki narrative provides a compelling, if controversial, answer to that question, and it is a story that will continue to haunt and inspire us for as long as we look up at the night sky and wonder where we came from. The Great Cataclysm and the Anunnaki's departure marked the end of the first age of humanity, but it was not the end of the Anunnaki's story on Earth. Their influence, though no longer a direct physical presence, continued to shape the civilizations that rose in their wake. The humans, now independent, were left with a rich and complex legacy, a kind of cultural and spiritual shadow that would forever linger in the annals of history. The new civilizations, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, all built upon the foundations laid by their Sumerian predecessors, and in doing so, they also built upon the mythology of the Anunnaki. The stories of the gods who came from the sky, of their rivalries, their creations, and their destruction, became the central themes of their new religions and their new mythologies. The Anunnaki, who had once been living, breathing beings, were now transformed into a kind of cosmic pantheon, a collection of powerful, immortal deities who ruled over the heavens and the earth. The rivalry between Enki and Enlil, which had been a tragic, world-ending conflict, was now reinterpreted as a cosmic struggle between the forces of order and chaos. Enki, the compassionate creator, was now known by different names in different cultures. Ea in Akkadian, for example, a kind and wise god of water and knowledge. Enlil, the stern and uncompromising commander, was now known as Marduk in Babylonian mythology, a powerful and righteous god who defeated the forces of chaos and brought order to the universe. This is a fascinating example of how a single historical event can be reinterpreted and retold in different cultures and different times, with the heroes and villains of the original story becoming the gods and monsters of the new one. This reinterpretation of ancient myths is a well-documented historical fact, a kind of scholarly debate that is still raging among archaeologists and historians. The Anunnaki's technological legacy also continued to shape the new civilizations. The knowledge of writing, agriculture, and metallurgy, which they had left behind, was now being used by humanity to create a new and in some ways more powerful civilization. The humans, with their newfound independence, were now free to innovate, to experiment, and to push the boundaries of what was possible. The great libraries of ancient Babylon, with their vast collections of clay tablets, were a direct consequence of the Anunnaki's gift of writing. The great ziggurats and temples, which were once the homes of the Anunnaki themselves, were now the homes of their human successors, a testament to the enduring power and influence of their architectural style. The Anunnaki had left, but their ghost remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The humans, in their attempts to understand their own origins and their own destiny, looked back at the stories of the Anunnaki and saw a reflection of themselves. They saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And in that reflection, they saw their own future, a future that was not predetermined by their creators, but was now in their own hands. This was a powerful and liberating realization, a kind of cosmic coming of age. The humans were no longer just a dependent species, they were an independent one, a species that was now free to make its own choices, to create its own legacy, and to forge its own destiny. And as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, became more and more a part of human history. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the Great Flood, and their eventual departure were no longer just myths. They were now a kind of cosmic origin story, a powerful and enduring narrative that would continue to haunt and inspire humanity for as long as we look up at the night sky and wonder where we came from. The Anunnaki had left, but their legacy remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche, a ghost that would never truly leave. The Anunnaki's departure did not erase their legend, it cemented it. The myths and stories of these sky-born beings became a central pillar of the newly emerging human religions. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, now without their living gods, began to codify their history and their beliefs into a powerful and enduring mythology. The great pantheon of Sumerian gods, a kind of cosmic family tree, was a direct reflection of the Anunnaki's own lineage and their complex relationships. Anu, the king of the gods, was a direct reflection of the Anunnaki king who had commanded the original expedition to Earth. His sons, Enki and Enlil, were now powerful and immortal deities, and their rivalry, which had been so destructive in life, was now a central theme in their new religious beliefs. This process of deification, of turning a historical figure into a god, is a well-documented phenomenon, a kind of historical fact that is still seen in many cultures today. But the most enduring and captivating legacy of the Anunnaki was not a god, but a planet, Nibiru. The humans, who had been told stories of this mythical world, began to look up at the night sky with a new kind of reverence and fear. They saw the cosmos not as a simple collection of stars, but as a vast, living tapestry, a place where their creators had come from, and a place where they might one day return. The idea of Nibiru, a great winged planet that appeared in the sky every few thousand years, became a central theme in their prophecies and their fears. It was a kind of cosmic timer, a celestial clock that was slowly counting down to a future event, a time of great change and great upheaval. The humans, who had been born from a cosmic intervention, now lived with the constant nagging fear of another one. They were, in a way, still living in the shadow of their creators, a shadow that stretched across the cosmos, and a shadow that would one day return. The search for Nibiru, which began as a desperate mission for the Anunnaki, became a kind of a cosmic obsession for a small but dedicated group of modern-day scholars and theorists. They pore over ancient texts, looking for clues, for hints, and for any shred of evidence that would prove the existence of this mythical planet. They argue that the reason we haven't found it yet is because its orbit is so vast and so elliptical that it spends most of its time in the cold, dark void of deep space, a ghost planet that only appears once every few thousand years. This theory, which is widely dismissed by mainstream astronomers, is a powerful and compelling one, And it is a direct consequence of the Anunnaki narrative. It is a testament to the idea that there is more to our history than we have been told, that the myths and legends of the past are not just stories, but a kind of hidden truth waiting to be discovered. The Anunnaki had come to Earth for gold, but they had also, in their own petty conflicts and their own profound mistakes, created a new species, a new world, and a new mythology. They had left, but their shadow remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the Great Flood, and their eventual departure were now our stories, and in those stories we saw a reflection of ourselves. We saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And as the human civilizations rose and fell, and as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, became more and more a part of our own history, a kind of cosmic origin story that we could never quite shake. And so, the legacy of the Anunnaki, of a time when a civilization from another world came to Earth and created a new species in its own image, is a story that continues to haunt and inspire us. It is a story that challenges our most fundamental beliefs about our origins, our history, and our place in the universe. It is a story that asks a simple but profound question. Are we alone, or are we, in some small way, a reflection of a long-lost past? The answer, for now, remains a mystery that is etched in the stars, and a mystery that is waiting to be solved. The legacy of the Anunnaki was not just a collection of myths and legends, it was also a story of power, of lineage, and of the enduring struggle for control. The human kings, who now ruled the new civilizations of Mesopotamia, were not just mortal rulers, they were seen as the direct descendants of the Anunnaki themselves. Their right to rule was not based on conquest or political maneuvering, but on a kind of cosmic bloodline, a direct connection to the gods who had created them. This concept of kingship, a kind of divine right to rule, was a powerful and enduring legacy of the Anunnaki's presence on Earth. It was a kind of historical fact, a kind of scholarly debate, that the legitimacy of a ruler is often tied to their perceived connection to the divine. In the case of the post-Sumerian kings, this connection was not just a myth, it was a reality, a direct consequence of a forbidden union between the Anunnaki and human females. The new human civilizations, from the Akkadians to the Babylonians, all embraced this concept of divine kingship. The kings saw themselves as the shepherds of the human flock, but the ultimate shepherd was always the Anunnaki, watching over them from their temples and their starships. This was a powerful and enduring legacy, a kind of cultural DNA that would continue to shape the human psyche for millennia to come. The kings of ancient Mesopotamia, with their magnificent palaces and their grand armies, were not just rulers. They were also priests, the ones who could speak to the gods and who could interpret their will. Their power was not their own. It was a reflection of the Anunnaki's power, and their legitimacy was derived from their close relationship with their divine masters. This dynamic of a ruler's power being tied to a divine source is a recurring theme throughout human history, and it is a direct consequence of the Anunnaki narrative. But the legacy of the Anunnaki was not just a story of power and lineage, it was also a story of technology and progress. The humans, with their newfound independence, were now free to innovate, to experiment, and to push the boundaries of what was possible. The knowledge of writing, agriculture, and metallurgy, which they had inherited from their creators, was now being used to create a new, and in some ways, more powerful civilization. The great libraries of ancient Babylon, with their vast collections of clay tablets, were a direct consequence of the Anunnaki's gift of writing. The great ziggurats and temples, which were once the homes of the Anunnaki themselves, were now the homes of their human successors, a testament to the enduring power and influence of their architectural style. The Anunnaki had left, but their ghost remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The humans, in their attempts to understand their own origins and their own destiny, looked back at the stories of the Anunnaki and saw a reflection of themselves. They saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And in that reflection, they saw their own future, a future that was not predetermined by their creators, but was now in their own hands. This was a powerful and liberating realization, a kind of cosmic coming of age. The humans were no longer just a dependent species, but an independent one, a species that was now free to make its own choices, to create its own legacy, and to forge its own destiny. And as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, became more and more a part of human history. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the Great Flood, and their eventual departure were no longer just myths. They were now a kind of cosmic origin story, a powerful and enduring narrative that would continue to haunt and inspire humanity for as long as we look up at the night sky and wonder where we came from. The Anunnaki had left, but their legacy remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche, a ghost that would never truly leave. This enduring influence of a forgotten people is one of the great mysteries of our past, and it is a testament to the power of a story that is both history and myth, both truth and legend. The enduring legacy of the Anunnaki was not just a story of power and lineage. It was also a story of survival, of a species that refused to be extinguished. The humans, a few scattered survivors in a world that was both new and old, were now on their own. They were no longer a workforce for their creators. They were a species with a destiny of its own. But the Anunnaki had not left them completely helpless. They had, in their final act of atonement, left behind a powerful legacy, a kind of cultural and technological DNA that would allow humanity to rise from the ashes of the Great Flood and the nuclear cataclysm. This legacy, a rich tapestry of myth, knowledge, and technology, would become the foundation for all future human civilizations. The new civilizations, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, all built upon the foundations laid by their Sumerian predecessors, and in doing so, they also built upon the mythology of the Anunnaki. The humans, now freed from the direct control of their creators, began to create their own civilizations, their own empires, and their own histories. The land of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of humanity and the site of its tragic downfall once again became the cradle of civilization. The knowledge of writing, agriculture, and metallurgy, which they had inherited from their creators, was now being used to create a new, and in some ways, more powerful civilization. The great libraries of ancient Babylon, with their vast collections of clay tablets, were a direct consequence of the Anunnaki's gift of writing. The great ziggurats and temples, which were once the homes of the Anunnaki themselves, were now the homes of their human successors, a testament to the enduring power and influence of their architectural style. The Anunnaki had left, but their ghost remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The most enduring and captivating legacy of the Anunnaki was not a god, but a planet, Nibiru. The humans, who had been told stories of this mythical world, began to look up at the night sky with a new kind of reverence and fear. They saw the cosmos not as a simple collection of stars, but as a vast living tapestry, a place where their creators had come from, and a place where they might one day return. The idea of Nibiru, a great winged planet that appeared in the sky every few thousand years, became a central theme in their prophecies and their fears. It was a kind of cosmic timer, a celestial clock that was slowly counting down to a future event, a time of great change and great upheaval. The humans, who had been born from a cosmic intervention, now lived with the constant nagging fear of another one. They were in a way still living in the shadow of their creators, a shadow that stretched across the cosmos, and a shadow that would one day return. The search for Nibiru, which began as a desperate mission for the Anunnaki, became a kind of cosmic obsession for a small but dedicated group of modern-day scholars and theorists. They pore over ancient texts, looking for clues, for hints, and for any shred of evidence that would prove the existence of this mythical planet. They argue that the reason we haven't found it yet is because its orbit is so vast and so elliptical that it spends most of its time in the cold, dark void of deep space, a ghost planet that only appears once every few thousand years. This theory, which is widely dismissed by mainstream astronomers, is a powerful and compelling one, and it is a direct consequence of the Anunnaki narrative. It is a testament to the idea that there is more to our history than we have been told, that the myths and legends of the past are not just stories, but a kind of hidden truth waiting to be discovered. The Anunnaki had come to Earth for gold, but they had also, in their own petty conflicts and their own profound mistakes, created a new species, a new world, and a new mythology. They had left, but their shadow remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the great flood, and their eventual departure were now our stories, and in those stories we saw a reflection of ourselves. We saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And as the human civilizations rose and fell, and as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, became more and more a part of our own history, a kind of cosmic origin story that we could never quite shake. This enduring influence of a forgotten people is one of the great mysteries of our past, and it is a testament to the power of a story a story that is both history and myth, both truth and legend. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, but not the end of the story. The tale of the Anunnaki is not just a historical narrative, it is a living, breathing part of our modern world. The myths and legends, once etched into clay tablets in a forgotten language, now echo through the halls of our libraries and the screens of our computers. The story of a species from another world, a species that came to Earth in a desperate search for gold and ended up creating us, is a powerful and enduring narrative. It is a story that challenges our most fundamental beliefs about our origins, our history, and our place in the universe. It is a story that asks a simple but profound question. Are we alone, or are we, in some small way, a reflection of a long-lost past? The answer, for now, remains a mystery that is etched in the stars, and a mystery that is waiting to be solved. The enduring influence of the Anunnaki narrative, particularly the Sitchin interpretation, can be seen in our modern culture, in our books, our movies, and our television shows. The idea of ancient aliens, of a forgotten past where gods walked the earth, has captured the imagination of millions. It is a story that provides a compelling, if controversial, answer to some of the great mysteries of our past, from the impossible precision of the pyramids to the sudden and dramatic leap in human technology. It is a story that gives a purpose to our existence, a kind of cosmic origin story that is both terrifying and inspiring. The Anunnaki, who had left, had not truly left. They had simply become a part of our own story, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The search for Nibiru, for the lost home of our creators, is a powerful metaphor for our own search for meaning, for our own desire to understand our origins. We look up at the stars and we wonder, are we alone? Are we the result of a random cosmic accident? Or are we the result of a deliberate act of creation? The Anunnaki narrative provides a compelling, if controversial, answer to that question, and it is a story that will continue to haunt and inspire us for as long as we look up at the night sky and wonder where we came from. The Anunnaki had come to Earth for gold, but they had also, in their own petty conflicts and their own profound mistakes, created a new species, a new world, and a new mythology. They had left, but their shadow remained, a powerful and enduring presence in the human psyche. The stories of their arrival, their rivalry, the Great Flood, and their eventual departure were now our stories, and in those stories we saw a reflection of ourselves. We saw a species with a profound capacity for both creation and destruction, for both compassion and cruelty. And as the human civilizations rose and fell, and as the millennia passed, the memory of the Anunnaki, of a time when gods walked the earth and when the sky was filled with starships, became more and more a part of our own history, a kind of cosmic origin story that we could never quite shake. This enduring influence of a forgotten people is one of the great mysteries of our past, and it is a testament to the power of a story that is both history and myth, both truth and legend. And as the last vestiges of their physical presence faded into the mists of time, their story sank into legend. Their myths and tales of a lost home in the heavens and of a species they had created were all that remained. And so, the vast tapestry of history with its endless threads of kings and empires, of triumphs and tragedies, has a beginning that is perhaps not of this world at all. We are the inheritors of a cosmic legacy, a legacy that is both beautiful and tragic, a legacy that is still waiting to be fully understood. The story of the Anunnaki, of a time when the heavens and the earth were intertwined, is now a part of our own story, a story that will continue for as long as we exist. The long journey, the rivalry between the brothers, the flood, and the final exodus, they all become a quiet whisper in the dark, a memory of a lost people and a lost world. Their story fades now, not with a bang, but with a gentle, silent sigh. The echoes of their presence grow softer, dissolving into the quiet hum of the universe. The stars outside your window are still there, vast and ancient, but perhaps now they hold a new secret, a new kind of silence. Let that silence carry you now, like a gentle boat on a vast, calm sea, and know that you are a part of a story that is so much bigger and so much older than you can possibly imagine. Let go of the questions and just float in the quiet wonder of it all. Sleep now and let the stars be your guide. End of script. Sweet dreams.